Globalization means that capital, big money, can be moved anywhere at any time without warning. In 1998, short-term capital was suddenly pulled out of Asia, crippling the miracle economy overnight.
When the Indonesian rupiah collapsed from being roughly 2,500 rupiah to the dollar to being what it is now, 10,000 rupiah to the dollar, the costs to Nike for each Indonesian laborer was cut to 25% of what it had been. And Nike got a great discount on Indonesian labor as a result, and did not unilaterally raise Indonesian wages to the same standard they had been prior to the devaluation of the rupiah.
With the economy collapsed and Indonesia on the verge of revolution, Suharto was forced to step down, having already stolen an estimated $15 billion. During his reign of more than 30 years, Suharto had handed out public utilities to his family and cronies. They owned most of the national power grid. Nothing was overlooked, from TV stations to a monopoly on taxis. Driving from Jakarta Airport, you even paid a toll to Suharto's daughter. These unfinished buildings are monuments to corruption on a scale unheard of in modern Asia, to what the World Bank called the miracle economy.
The bank presents itself as an economic development agency focused on the reduction of poverty. But in fact, the bank operated during the entire Cold War as an institution that distributed resources to mostly authoritarian regimes in the Third World that supported the West in the Cold War. So you had the irony of the West claiming that what they were defending in the Cold War was democracy and a certain vision of freedom, but doing so by upholding dictatorships like Indonesia around the world. What they did was they had plenty of projects, some of which surely were valuable, many of which were not. Every one of these projects, from the Indonesian government officials' point of view, was an opportunity to skim, to live a luxurious life, and the accumulated theft over the course of Suharto's new order, roughly 3 decades, was $10 billion that's unaccounted for, out of a total of about $30 billion that was loaned. And when I said to the Auditor General of the World Bank, what if a group of Indonesian citizens or even the government were to challenge the World Bank in the World Court over this loss of money? The citizens who bear the burden of this debt never got the money. Why should it still sit on their shoulders to be repaid? And his response was, we would be bankrupted. And I said, why? And he said, because this has gone on the world over.
I went to Washington to interview the chief economist of the World Bank, Nicholas Stern. I asked him to explain how almost 30% of World Bank loans to Indonesia had been lost or stolen.
We simply don't know what that number is.
Here's your own internal report, August 97. I quote, we estimate that at least 20 to 30% of Government of Indonesia development budget funds are diverted through informal payments to government staff and politicians.
That number was plucked out of the air. Lots of times we have to guess with numbers, and the person who wrote that was guessing. Somebody comes up with a number and it gets recycled. But
a lot of money.
I don't want to dismiss the issue. It's just let's not get hung up on one figure, which isn't a particularly hard
no,
figure.
but I mean, if it's a third of what the World Bank has put into one country...
No, then it's a serious question. When you have a loan, there's a lender and a borrower, and they share the responsibility in some way.
There's a strong case that has been made by people who've seen this evidence that the World Bank was duped by the Suharto regime, claiming that poverty had dropped to 30 million, and in fact poverty was around about 60 million.
Let's talk about the harder figures. The income poverty figures are always the most difficult ones to get your hands on. But I think the illiteracy figures in the infant mortality figures are in this case probably more reliable. And there was some progress during that 30-year period, significant progress, I mean cutting illiteracy by half and so on. That's a very important step forward, so let's not lose sight of that.
In 1997, the World Bank described the economy under Suharto in a famous report as absolutely dynamic, doing everything right, terrific, brilliant. You know, by that time, the whole Asian thing had already started to collapse. It wasn't until the following year that the World Bank, for the first time in 30 years, had anything to say about a regime that is guilty of mass murder. Why was there such a silence that seemed to a lot of people simply to be complicity with this murderous dictatorship?
I think if we look back on our analysis of the economy and the politics at the time, we got a number of things wrong, and we have to understand that. We're going to get things wrong again. Not so many people called the Asian crisis before it happened. We failed along with
That's your job, though, isn't it? You're all economists with fantastic degrees and brilliant backgrounds, and how can you get it that wrong?
We're going to get it wrong some of the time. I think non-economists get it wrong a lot more often than economists. But this isn't a precise game, and there are going to be a number of occasions in the future where we get things wrong too.
So globalization creates debts, and debt creates misery, creates unemployment, creates the crisis, creates privatization, a lot of states' enterprise being privatized. So people will have to pay more to have an access for instance, like health, education. So it's not natural. Debt is not natural. It's designed.
So in effect, the money stolen by the Suharto family is being repaid.
Yeah.
By
us, by the children.
Every day, more than $100 million is transferred in debt repayments from the poorest countries on earth to the richest. The poverty of families like this is paying off Indonesia's huge debt. The conditions of the IMF's latest loan include a reduction in subsidies on certain fuel and food. Half this man's monthly wage of less than £40 goes on medical treatment for his children who suffer from a serious blood disorder. As prices go up, he cannot even afford the special drugs that keep them alive.
Keadaan anak saya yaitu yang pertama dia menderita sakit. Jadi tiap bulan dia harus transfusi darah. Jadi kalau seandainya nggak transfusi darah, dia tiap akhir bulan itu pucat. Kayak sekarang contohnya, bibirnya udah pada putih dua-duanya. Jadi akhir bulan itu mesti harus transfusi darah. Itu udah pasti. Pusingnya bukan kepalang. Ya kalau seandainya saya sakit gitu nggak bisa masuk kerja, ya udah apa boleh buat. Paling kita bisa cari pinjaman buat berobat anak gitu. Nanti setelah kita kerja lagi baru kita bayar gitu. Kita cicil.
Udah mandi kok masih.
Kalau seandainya gitu ya, barang-barang naik, sedangkan UMR gaji gitu naiknya nggak seberapa, ya kita otomatis ya kita serahin diri sama Tuhan aja dah. Mungkin yang jelas mungkin berobat pun kayaknya nggak bisa. Jadi kita pasrah apa adanya. Sebab gimana kalau kita paksain untuk
harusnya setiap pagi anak-anak kasih teh manis, sekarang enggak. Susu juga enggak.
Ya paling kita bisanya teriak sama pemerintah, ikut lewat FNPBI begitu. Kita tuntut pemerintah dengan supaya naikin UMR 100%.
Yang penting sekarang kan alhamdulillah bisa ketemu buat berobat. Biar walaupun kita makan pakai ikan asin, tapi udah alhamdulillah.
In the global economy, one American corporation dominates the world trade in food grains, while almost half the world's population, like this family, attempt to live on less than $2 a day. What do you say to those 17 million people who called for a complete, and I repeat, complete cancellation of debt as the only way to lift the huge number of poor people in the world out of poverty?
I'd say two things. First, what will lift people out of poverty is not cancelling their debt, but what policies their countries pursue, whether they educate poor people, whether they give them health. And so the question, and then what sort of economies they try to run. Do they integrate them into the world economy, or do they run corrupt economies? Those are the primary determinants of how well countries will do. That is the answer to what determines whether people get out of poverty. It can be done. It has been done. Should we cancel the debt? Canceling debt is one way of giving resources to poor countries. Mm-hmm. What I'd like to see is a much greater flow of resources to poor countries. I'd like to see the markets of the industrialized countries opened so that these countries where people are poor and can produce agriculture are able to export. That's what will get them out of poverty. The statement debt relief is the only thing that will get them out of poverty is wrong. It would help, provided it is accompanied by a whole set of other measures.
But surely debt, even in one's own life, and especially a poor person's life, is the greatest cause of real poverty.
No.
And when you have a country devoting half its budget to paying off a debt, when you have the poorest countries in the world sending out millions of dollars into the rich world, surely as a priority, that debt has to be either relieved substantially or go altogether. Doesn't that make it just seems common sense to me? If I got that wrong?
Yeah, you've got it wrong.
Oh,
let me explain.
Okay.
First of all, you are indebted, and I am indebted, and I would not be better off if I asked somebody to come and cancel my debt, because I'd never be able to borrow again. And debt is a normal way of borrowing in order to do things, purchase goods, invest. When you don't have the resources, and they'll generate an income and you'll repay. So the notion that all debt should be canceled is a bad one. Financial systems operate on the basis of debt that is paid.
Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, in a very comprehensive report, said, and I quote, "The institutions of globalization have yet to seriously address the issue of human rights in a democratic fashion. Globalization has caused global conditions of inequality and discrimination." What's your response to that?
I simply can't respond because I have no idea what evidence they're referring to. Globalization has caused discrimination? I'd have thought it was the opposite. I'd have thought that...
No, for instance, they singled out workers in third world economic processing zones. Again, part of a prescription, may not be IMF prescription, but certainly part of a global prescription, in which it said these workers were prey for exploitation, and because unemployment, for instance, they mentioned Indonesia, had been forced down by the so-called economic crisis of the late 90s, their human rights were lost.
No, Indonesia grew as a result of integrating into the global economy from the 60s on, and incomes in Indonesia rose. It was a dictatorship. Some of their rights were suppressed, and it was a very bad dictatorship.
Excuse me, Mr. Fisher, as you say, some of their rights were oppressed. A third of the population of East Timor died or were killed under the Suharto regime.
What are you asking me that question for? Do you think we supported the Suharto regime? Don't be ridiculous.
Well, did you speak out against it? Did your institution, the IMF, speak out? The World Bank didn't. The first time after 30-odd years in there, the first time they spoke out was 1998. What did the IMF say about it?
When the IMF went into Indonesia, it insisted on a removal of a host of corrupt practices that began to weaken that regime. It was not an intended consequence, but it was intended that we went in and helped remove the corrupt practices in a variety of monopoly areas.
And because now the government, as recommended by the IMF, has already cutting off a lot of subsidies, not only oil and electricity, but also water and education and subsidies and agriculture. So it means that the workers, if they have sons or daughters, they have to pay more if they want to put their children to school. Before, of course, people eat 3 meals a day, but now they have to also make efficiency. So they eat, instead of 3, they eat twice a day, and or they reduce the quality of the food. So that's why maybe the level of productivity is getting lower, because people are getting poor and getting tired, and if you are tired you cannot work properly.
You know, capitalism is a lovely law. It says it don't count as it sells. When it costs too much to build it at home, you just build it cheaper someplace else. Well, it's a down on the union, and we're paying the USA.
2 years ago, thousands of protesters from all over the world converged on the American city of Seattle, where the World Trade Organization was meeting. This was news because it happened in America. And yet throughout the world, in Africa, Latin America, Asia, a deeper movement against globalization has been growing for years, but this is not considered news. On every continent, millions of ordinary people have protested against the power of the IMF and the World Bank and the imposition of Western power. People have marched and petitioned against privatization, against selling off their water, against turning their farms into suppliers for the dinner tables of the rich. Now the protests have spread to Western countries, from Seattle to Melbourne, London to Genoa. The coverage of these events follows a pattern. It seems it's only news when there's violence, even when the great majority of the protesters are peaceful. In contrast, the violence of the economic policies they are protesting about is seldom news. In the weeks and days leading up to May Day in London, the police and the government orchestrated a propaganda campaign. The aim clearly was to alienate the public from the demonstrators by representing them collectively as violent and by suppressing the very issues that have public support.
The limits of tolerance are passed when protesters, in the name of some spurious cause, seek to inflict fear, terror, violence and criminal damage on our people and property.
To Tony Blair, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is a spurious cause. When May Day came, 6,000 police turned part of London's West End into a giant detention camp.
I think the issue of violence, which we're constantly asked about, is our main way in. I think that the key to these things is actually getting mass amounts of people involved, because the media will put one point of view across time and time again, you know, the mindless hooligan side. But when you think about the mass redundancies, the poverty, the starvation, the literal raping of a country through third world debt and what have you, you know, that is violence on a huge scale. It's genocide.
The newest ruler of the world is the World Trade Organization based in Geneva. The Economist magazine calls it an embryo world government, and yet no one has voted for it. the effect of its policies make it illegal for governments to hinder the profits of big business. This is known as free trade.
If there's one feature about the global economy, it's the companies have globalized. But we haven't regulated the global companies. And that's the change that we've got to put into this international system if we're ever going to get rules that are fairer to workers, fairer to the world's poor, fairer to all of those who are affected by this international production system.
People can't stand by. They can't be spectators when we're faced with forces like this. They join this movement and the movement starts to gather momentum. Already we've had some extraordinary successes. We managed to stop the implementation of a crazy, I call the multilateral agreement on investment, which would have allowed corporations to sue governments for the removal of any law which they didn't like. Now that was being promoted, that idea, by the 29 most powerful countries on earth. It was being promoted by all the major multinational corporations and all the big institutions such as the World Trade Organization. And a ragged band of dissenters around the world managed to stop it. We beat them. And if we can beat that, we can beat anything.
What is with the people is the fact that the corporations and the superpower are using more and more fabricated propaganda. People can now see through the spin. People know they cannot believe anymore what is said. And the people are starting to withdraw their support. They're starting to say, no, a government that only protects the Pepsi and the Coke and the McDonald's is not our government.
In rich countries like Britain, globalization is well advanced. The disastrous selling off of the railways and the creeping privatization of everything from healthcare to air traffic control. The financial pages celebrate a booming economy, yet 1 in 5 British children grows up in poverty. There are almost 10 million Britons living in poverty. The gap between the rich and the rest gets wider, and this is said to be a spurious cause. All over the world, millions of ordinary people are asking why they have no say in decisions that bring hardship to their lives. They don't accept the view of President Bush and Prime Minister Blair that there's no other way. In Britain, the fact that only 25% of the electorate voted for the Blair government is part of this great unease. Why, people ask, should we accept a system of winners and losers, a system that puts a dollar sign on every public service and almost every human value? Why not abolish the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization and replace them with genuine trade and development institutions that are democratically accountable? And why not cancel a debt that condemns nations like Indonesia to poverty and disease? These are dangerous times. The one superpower left in the world has made its ambitions clear. This is a document of the United States Space Command. It says, the globalization of the world economy will continue with a widening between haves and have-nots. It says only military dominance will protect America's commercial interests. Why should we accept this? Why should our children have to face these divisions and dangers? None of them is God-given. All of them can be changed.